Hi, I'm Derek, and welcome back to Fun Scale Models. In this video series, we're focusing on the park scale model of the P-63 Kingcobra. In the past two videos, we showed the construction of the tail, the fuselage, and the wing. In this video, we'll be focusing on building the cockpit and the canopy. In the previous video, we identified that the center of gravity was too far forward, requiring the need to move the battery pack as far aft as possible. This was originally intended to be situated underneath the canopy hatch, and in having to move the battery hatch, it opened up the opportunity to add a detailed cockpit. In preparation for installing the cockpit, the canopy frame was painted interior green, as was some of the formers within the cockpit area. The cockpit design itself was created in CAD and then printed out on both cardstock and standard paper. Here you can see some of the tools that are needed. One item that's not showing in here that I ended up using was Canopy glue when gluing the individual parts together. This actually worked really well and I highly recommend it. In this picture, you can see some of the parts that were printed onto light cardstock. The first item that I decided to cut out was the radio, which is the darker cross item in the middle of the page. Scoring first and then cutting out the outline, I folded it into a box structure. That's where the canopy glue came in very handy, and I used that to glue this piece all together. The instrument panel is actually made up of several pieces that are glued together. Several of the panels I glued additional backing behind them to give them a raised look to help create a sense of depth. The cockpit tub was one main piece. This was scored and bent first, and then it was separated into two halves. This is due to needing to be on either side of one of the formers. Using clamps and canopy glue again, the cockpit tub was glued in one section at a time. While the main parts to the seat were printed onto cardstock, the seat belts themselves were printed onto standard paper. This allowed more flexibility in gluing them to the seat itself. And here is a picture of the completed seat. In addition to the seat, there are also some other sub-assemblies. Throttle quadrant is shown in this picture. And here's another view. And you can also see the control stick in this picture. The last main part of the cockpit was the plate that the battery sits on. A feature of the model mentioned in the initial video is that its canopy comes from flat sheet. This can be created by using a pattern provided with the design. Here you can see the initial pattern. However, the final version is slightly updated and will be updated with the plans. We start by printing out the frames and inside frames of the canopy. This is printed on standard 20-pound sheet. Here they are cut, scored, and folded over. I used spray adhesive to glue the two halves together, creating one side with the red frame and the other side for the green underside. The next step was to cut away all of the areas where the glass will be. These two frames were then glued on to 3 mil clear plastic sheet, creating the canopy itself. The exterior areas were trimmed away, leaving the completed parts. Starting with the rear section, the center line was glued on using canopy glue. Once that had dried, it was formed around the sides and rear, as well as the bottom, completing the rear section. The forward section is very similar to the rear, but there's some additional steps. Starting with gluing the center section first, then the doors and door bottoms, leaving the door top unglued at this time. The rear tab or rear section was folded over and glued into the door tabs. Then the next section, followed by the third, and finally the front windscreen was wrapped around and glued to the frame. You do need to give it some time to make sure that each of the separate sections dries first before adding the other one. I also created a profile pilot that can sit in the cockpit. With the cockpit and canopy complete, the last major part of the model was the covering. I've chosen to do this model in printed tissue, and I've done a previous video on that, and I will link it to this one. Using lightweight white tissue, you can see the patterns and panels printed on legal-sized sheets. Starting with the underside of the wingtip was added, and then the main panel. Once the bottom of the wing was covered, it was placed on the table, weighted, and pinned with a shim underneath W8. This is to ensure that when we're covering, the washout remains in the wing. Here you can see the outer tip has been covered, and again, the whole structure is pinned to the board with the shim for shrinking. The center section was completed, including the aileron extension coming out, which is fed into the fuselage. The fuselage was covered very much the same, alternating sides and moving forward. Here you can see the speed controller is already in place. It's important to think ahead because once the model is covered, there's not a lot of space. Additional subparts like the air intake were added at this time and covered. Once the covering was complete, the wing was glued to the fuselage, ensuring that it's true and accurate. The tail section was also glued on at this time. I mounted the receiver in the main canopy hatch area. And these are final shots of the model. The model came in at the weight expected. Total weight with the landing gear is 7.7 ounces. Without the landing gear, it's 6.9 ounces. And then there's another 2 ounces for the battery pack to be added. The main things left to do are to hook up the controls, finalize weight and balance, and prep for the maiden. Thank you so much for joining me for this series. Please like and subscribe and share your comments.